right, happy Friday, welcome back. Concepts in Training, diving into the concept of speed, cardio, and conditioning. So got an interesting conversation recently with somebody who's like, well, you know, we're talking about doing sprints, and I mentioned how sprints aren't cardio, and he's like, well, wait a minute, they're not cardio? You know, there's like this age-old misconception that doing a sprint is, you know, conditioning. Well, yes and no, right? Sprinting is a training tool. When we look at sprinting, we look at really speed work. You know, people oftentimes use running and sprinting as like some kind of cardio, or especially if you're a former athlete, you probably had to use it as some kind of punishment. Well, when we look at creating speed, we have to think about the fact that if you're trying to develop speed, you have to be able to move at 90 to 95% of max capacity to really actually make any significant gains or make increases in your overall top speed, right? Whether that's with a bar, whether that's with, you know, actual sprinting or agility work. When we start to look at speed and speed training, when we're trying to develop speed as a physiological outcome, right? And we'll talk about speed, strength, speed, and absolute strength is kind of physiological adaptations. When we start to look at speed, there's a difference between sprinting and running, right? Because sprinting is max effort, it's max velocity. Running, sub-max effort, sub-max velocity. Jogging, sub-max effort, and sub-max velocity, right? So when we start to look at these things, when we look at adaptations, right, well, speed in and of itself is an anaerobic activity, right? It's very short duration, it's very high velocity, there's not a whole lot of aerobic output going on. Then we start to look at actual running, right? And this is where we're getting into with this one individual was sprinting is not cardio, all right? Because then we start to actually get into cardiovascular work, we start to get into more aerobic-based work. We're not looking at maximal effort, short duration activities. We're looking at long duration, lower intensity, sustainable sustainable movements, right? And it doesn't have to be just running, right? You can do it on a rower, you can do it on a bike, doesn't really matter, right? Because what we're looking for is consistent heart rate outputs or cardiac outputs in that aerobic training. So when we start to look at adaptations, really especially when we look at cardio, sprinting or speed work isn't cardio, okay? At least if you're doing it right. Now, if you're tired, you're not gonna move at max velocity. So your sprinting then becomes jogging or running, and when you get even more tired, that running becomes jogging. So when we start looking at sprinting isn't speed work, right? Until it becomes, because sprinting will become running, but it's not sprinting anymore. So when we start to look at adding cardio, when we start to look at adding conditioning work, understand that max velocity is an adaptation, right? Being able to sprint maximally and really just drive output anaerobically is an adaptation we can achieve in training. When we start getting lower intensity, then also we start looking at like more cardio, more aerobic work, which is going to be more lung-based and cardiac output, how much blood volume you can pump throughout the body. Those are different adaptations that we're trying to get. So when we start to look at speed work, when we start to look at maximal velocity, and then when we start to look at cardio or conditioning, understanding that speed is like speed work or sprinting is not a cardiovascular adaptation, it's an anaerobic adaptation. And then once you stop moving at max velocity, that's where you're gonna start getting into. So especially if you're trying to develop one of those adaptations, like being able to move fast, you probably wanna have a lot of rest times. If you're trying to increase your cardiac output, you probably wanna have less rest times, but also wanna maintain a little bit of a lower intensity. So that's just kind of sporadic, is off the cuff kind of thought I had today just based on a conversation I had with somebody. But being able to understand that's the difference between sprinting and speed and cardio, and what those physiological adaptations are. So that's a brief overview of that. Until next week, we'll see ya.